which is in the southeast of Germany, not too far from the Austrian border, and I mentioned that in particular because it will play a certain role later on in my presentation. It's just about, by car, a bit more than an hour from the Austrian border. Actually, what I'm going to say will link up with what has been said during the last presentations, and particularly in the discussion that followed. And I will start with a basic contention, and that basic contention is that social work will have to become more theoretical and more political. And I think that is what has also been said in the discussion. In order to be able to cope with the spillovers of armed conflict into social work in Western European countries, which will not stop, but which I think all experts agree upon will accompany us for the next decades even, and which will primarily affect the Western European countries with huge migration and refugee movements. And in order to elaborate on this contention, I would like to make a little excursion, so to speak, and look back at the positioning of social work in European countries. I think even though the history and the context of origin of social work is quite different in different countries, the origins of social work in Germany, France, or England are different. Even though that is the case, I think one can generalize that cum grano salis, social work in all European countries, has been rather apolitical and rather atheoretical. The attempts to establish social work as a human rights profession has been a move to counteract these tendencies, but it doesn't seem to have had very pervasive effects, particularly if I look at the German context. And in actual practice, it lacks, in education and in social work practice, from my perspective, a theoretical framework, at least very often. Moreover, the paradigm of a human rights profession, as it presents itself nowadays, does not necessarily include political positionings or a political analysis. I think we are dealing with a dialect of political analysis in social work. Actually, slightly modifying a statement by Rosa Luxemburg, one could say if social work thinks of itself as being an apolitical helping profession, which I think very often it does and which would be very characteristic for Germany. If it does so, it is political without noticing it. Because at each stage of social work development has been directed and shaped by political decisions, and I think this is also something which Sanela Basic emphasized. She also said that social work has been a practice branch of social policy, and that lately social policy has primarily followed a neoliberal agenda, and of course social work has always been in the wake of that. To be sure, some criticism of neoliberal ideologies has entered social work discourse, but this has not, if I am observing this correctly, this has not happened systematically, and is largely dependent on the personal preferences of teaching personnel and also students who choose to attend those courses or do not. And the effect of that has been that social work has been infiltrated by lots of neoliberal discourses, and unfortunately this has happened without social work discourse in very many instances noticing what is actually happening. Another consequence, referring everything back to our subject, is that there has been an incapability in social work to identify the migration regimes we are dealing with that have developed and are embedded in the neoliberal discourse. We are not dealing with apolitical migration regimes, but we are dealing with migration regimes that are very highly politicized, and very many social workers, theoreticians, I think, and practitioners are not aware of that. I would contend that in actual practice it is hegemonic policies, in our case in the widest sense of the word, neoliberal policies that regimen social work, determine the aims of social work, and define what success in social work means. While social work itself, talking about theoreticians and practitioners, have virtually no influence on the political discourses that shape theory and practice in social work. This is changing now a little bit, but particularly as far as the practical field is concerned, I think this is still true. It follows that the decisions that determine A, the areas of social work, and that would also concern the refugee area or social work in post-war reconstruction, the areas of social work, the clientele social work should deal with, and the methods social work should use, are very often made outside the social work field, and they are subject to varying political vicissitudes. And this is also true, referring back to what is happening in Germany now, for what has been going on there since last autumn, when finally the refugee discourse emerged and really swept over social work and is dominating social work right now. The present boom of refugee work in German social work is not due to the social work profession deciding that there is an urgent problem. The problem was there before last autumn. And this now takes me back to why I mentioned that we are very close to the Austrian border. The problem has been there, and we have experienced that very acutely, for about 2 years, when actually students came into the department and said, there is something going on out there. We are approached by social institutions in the region because there is a dire need of social workers, because the region is swept with unaccompanied minors. And here you would have one of the pictures. The police had been picking up unaccompanied minors that were coming over from Austria every morning, generally in the early morning hours when traffickers took them over the borders. And one has to say that at least some of these traffickers that are so much under criticism nowadays were acting quite responsibly, because they unloaded the unaccompanied minors in areas where they knew they would be found and where they knew they would be taken care of. So the police picked up 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, depending, minors in the early morning hours, took them to the youth welfare institution, because that is the general procedure. Germany being a participant of the UN Child Protection Convention, that means they have to be handed over to the youth welfare institutions, and they have to take care of them the same way they take care of German minors. Now, this turned out not to be feasible in the long run with the major numbers of unaccompanied minors. So generally they have been taken to sheltered housing, but what has to happen, and this is where our students came in, they have to be taken care of 24 hours a day. And that meant that they needed night shifts. There were just not enough people to make the night shifts, and that is where they went into our departments and asked for students to be doing that. Now the markets for social workers in the bigger cities in Germany is virtually empty. The so-called Association of German Communities, that's an association representing the interests of towns and cities to its federal government, demands that 50,000 more social workers have to be employed in order to take care of the refugee issues. There is an absolutely dire need. And here are just some more pictures and numbers regarding what has been happening since last September. This is a group of unaccompanied minors in Regensburg, and these are some numbers of what has been happening since July 2015. A number of problems arise from that situation. While we can observe that social workers very willingly accepted that new political importance that has been attributed to refugee work, on the other hand, what we can observe is that there is a lack of qualification for this particular kind of work. and the problems that emanate from the fact that social workers are almost exclusively at the moment occupied with the refugee problem, or that the largest majority is occupied with the refugee problem, is that they have at best a very rough idea what the political, or for that matter economic background of the refugee movements are. They have no idea that there is extensive research on the causes of war, because that of course has never been part of the social work curriculum. They don't know that there are theories of war, and, which probably is one of the most important issues, they don't know about the political, social and psychological consequences of war experiences. Is that all important for social work? My answer would, of course, be yes, it is important for social work, because help, and that is what they are offering to do, help is the big catchword, help is not an apolitical concept. Even though many social workers see themselves as politically innocent helpers. As a matter of fact, there is hardly anything more characteristic of the self-image of social work than the illusion of political neutrality. I think this has been highly problematic in any social work context, and the class question has been mentioned in other presentations, but it becomes almost an impossible position when it comes to social work and armed conflict. And in the following, I would like to corroborate that argument and single out 3 examples that characterize probably the malaise of social work in general, but particularly of social work under conditions of armed conflict in particular. And these are and I think I've got that here, what are the target groups, the clientele of social work in the wake of armed conflict? And what are the criteria employed by defining those who need support, who need help? And this is, of course, where help becomes a very political concept, which many social workers are not aware of. B, what are the methods used to deal with survivors of armed conflict in social work? And does social work evaluate these methods critically? And I want to single out one particular method, and that is trauma work. And see what are the practical issues social workers are confronted with. And here, if I have the time, I will again recur to the German example. First, regarding the question, who needs it? Social workers often have the illusion that they are there just for whoever is needy. But if we look at the refugee issue, it becomes very obvious that it's not social work that determines who is needy. To make it concrete, who determines in the present situation in Germany that people fleeing the Syrian theater of war are in need? They are the ones who are really the first-class refugees. If they manage to reach Germany, and that is of course a big question at the moment, do they manage to reach Germany? They get political asylum. But those coming from Afghanistan, who until very recently also enjoyed political asylum, are no longer considered first-class refugees. Now, social work is confronted with those issues. The same, of course, goes for people from the Western Balkans who are deported now in large numbers because they are not considered refugees at all any longer. And since they are not labeled as refugees politically any longer, they are not considered to be in need. So what does it mean if social work says they are there for the needy? It's not social work that determines who is in need. And the question is, of course, can social work be oblivious to the political interests behind the labeling of one group as needy and the other one as not needing support? The Roma example has been mentioned. The Roma example is also very relevant in the German situation, because for historical reasons, you know that they were part of the group probably that was persecuted by the National Socialists. they have a privileged position. Now, somebody coming from Kosovo who is not a Roma would not be considered as needy as a Roma would be considered as needy. But the reasons behind that are of a deeply political nature and are not evaluated on the basis who is needy for what reasons. Another issue referring to needy groups is gender, which is also mentioned in the program. The question who is subject to gender-specific violence has come up again very recently. We have always assumed that females are almost exclusively the target group. What we are experiencing now is that apparently we have grossly neglected sexual violence against males. And this is one of the issues that also turns up in practical work now, that social workers approach us as allegedly people who know something about it as we are teaching the subject, saying we have the feeling there is something, that there is a problem with the unaccompanied male minors we have, and we have a suspicion they have been subject to sexual violence, but hardly anything is known about it. So this would be one of the issues. I think regarding time, I restrict myself to the problem of methods. One big method that is also of sweeping importance at the moment is trauma work. All the social workers are concerned with trauma work at present. This concept is enthusiastically embraced by social workers with very good intentions, but with very little awareness that the concept has been under scrutiny for a long time and that it may not be the best concept, at least not the way it is practiced. And of course, it is practiced primarily by means of the famous PTSD manuals, which most social workers are familiar with. We know by now that this concept is very political in nature, and that it carries with it a number of very important problems. First of all, the fact that framing armed conflict and the consequences of armed conflict in terms of physical and psychological vulnerability depoliticizes the experience of those who are concerned. It entails a tendency to transform social and political experience into biological or pathological events that detach them from the circumstances causing it. And social work is very much engaged in doing that, and the question is, of course, what is social work doing there if it psychologizes political events? And my suggestion would be it merges without knowing what is happening with the neoliberal concept of vulnerability and of subjectivity, where the political and economic causes that lead to what we call trauma are really ignored to a very large extent, which of course would be in the interest of certain political and economic groups. So social work has to be aware of the fact, I would contend, that medical and psychological interventions, and there is quite some evidence for that, will just not work in practice if they are morally and politically blind. Suffering in armed conflicts arises in a social context, and this context must be taken into consideration and cannot just be ignored. And this is largely happening. Social work, at least again talking from the German experiences, also out of lack of knowledge. And this is perhaps where I wouldn't quite agree with Zanella. I think there is a tremendous lack of knowledge, and not only of courage. Also plays a role in this. So helpers have to acknowledge that they have to confront with themselves with the political dimensions of what in Western discourse are called traumatic experiences. To sum up these examples, which are just is the attempt of very shortly highlighting, yes, and taking out some examples of what is happening. And of course, by no means have I been able to grasp all the areas relevant to the relation between social work and armed conflict. Social work acting without an elaborate political consciousness and not just some vague political consciousness. Acting without an elaborate political consciousness is problematic and will in the long run, I think, be unsuccessful, and something that has also been mentioned beforehand, will deprofessionalize and actually will get lost as a meaningful profession. When it comes to dealing with the consequences of armed conflict, this problematic becomes even more salient, because social work with survivors of armed conflict is a resource which regulates access to support, determines who is needy, is actively involved in boundary drawings between those who are allegedly needy and those who are allegedly not needy, participates in categorizations of deserving survivors, in our present situation, Syrians and undeserving survivors, for instance, people from the Western Balkans. So what is needed, I would suggest, is a critical analysis of the current position of social work activities, of the contradictions and ambivalences that ensue, and the possibilities that can be developed from a critical perspective, a critical political perspective, which I think is very urgently needed. Dealing with these challenges will require new partnerships, which I think is also something that has already been alluded to, new skills, new interdisciplinary alliances, probably, has also been mentioned, moving social work more into the area or the vicinity of peace and conflict studies, which would make it more political to start out with, and thus also equipping social work better for dealing with these issues in a very practical sense. And last not least, to emphasize that again, also to prevent the ongoing deprofessionalization of social work. Thank you.
Thank you. I forgot to tell you before that it would be nice if any one of you could keep in mind resonating this question after all this presentation.